Okay, let's unpack this. It's the night of June 12th, 1994. The scene: the affluent, seemingly serene neighborhood of Brentwood in Los Angeles.
Right, very upscale area.
But outside a quiet condominium gate, a discovery is made that is anything but serene. The brutally murdered bodies of two people lie there. Nicole Simpson, the ex-wife of a man who really embodied American success, and her friend, a young waiter named Ronald Goldman.
And this wasn't just, a local crime story. It immediately felt different.
Absolutely. This was a moment that would send shockwaves across the country, peeling back layers of celebrity, race, and justice itself.
What unfolded from that night wasn't simply a double murder investigation. It rapidly morphed into this unprecedented media phenomenon, a legal clash of titans, and a cultural touchstone the world instantly labeled the trial of the century.
Yeah, that label stuck immediately.
It wasn't just about the guilt or innocence of one man, O.J. Simpson. It became a national interrogation of really deep-seated issues like race relations, the power of celebrity and wealth, and the very foundations of the American legal system. It put everything under a microscope.
And that's the mission of this deep dive. We've gone through a stack of sources, assembling a comprehensive look at the O.J. Simpson case. We're going to trace the story from his rise to prominence, through the crime and the complex investigation.
The criminal trial, the civil trial.
Right, for both trials, and examine the aftermath and the enduring legacy of this whole saga.
We want to guide you through the key events, the controversies that really defined it, and unpack the profound societal implications using the material we have. We'll explore why this case didn't just capture the nation's attention, but why it ripped open these fault lines and left such an indelible mark.
So where do we start? I think we have to begin with understanding the man himself, before that night, before all the accusations. The story of O.J. Simpson's life before the trial is often portrayed as, well, the ultimate American dream realized.
That's the narrative often presented, yeah, and it's certainly compelling on the surface. Orenthal James Simpson was born on July 9th, 1947, in San Francisco. His beginnings were decidedly humble. He grew up in a housing project. His father left when he was young, and his mother worked incredibly hard as a hospital attendant to support the family.
And his sources highlight early physical struggles, too. He suffered from rickets as a child.
Yeah, had to wear leg braces until he was about 5 years old.
A detail that maybe makes his later athletic prowess even more remarkable,
It really does. He was also described as growing up on the street, and by age 13, he had reportedly joined a gang called the Persian Warriors. His first arrest came at 15 for fighting, so it wasn't an easy path by any means.
So from those challenges, physical health, getting into trouble on the streets, football became his escape, his way out.
Absolutely, that was his ticket. He excelled in high school, earned an athletic scholarship to the City College of San Francisco. There, he truly began to shine, setting national junior college rushing records.
And that performance, that really catapulted him to a major four-year university.
Yes. His success led him straight to the University of Southern California, USC, in 1967. This is where his legend truly began to grow. He earned All-American honors twice.
Big deal.
Huge. And in 1968, won the most prestigious award in college football, the Heisman Trophy. Winning the Heisman is, it's a massive deal. It means you were the most outstanding player in the entire country.
That national recognition basically guaranteed him a top spot in the professional league, right?
Without a doubt. The Buffalo Bills selected him as the first overall pick in the 1969 NFL Draft. He played 11 seasons in the league, 9 with Buffalo, and the final 2 back home with the San Francisco 49ers.
And his statistics during that time are just staggering.
They really are. He accumulated over 11,000 rushing yards, scored 76 touchdowns, and totaled over 14,000 all-purpose yards. In 1973, he made history, became the first player in the NFL to rush for over 2,000 yards in a single season, and he did it in just 14 games. He was named Player of the Year multiple times and was a 5-time All-Pro from 1972 to 1976.
So by the time he retired in 1979, he wasn't just a great football player. He was an absolute superstar. A national hero. He was the Juice, and his public image was just golden.
Totally.
That level of iconic status is so crucial to understanding why the later accusations were so utterly shocking to the public. It completely contradicted the man they thought they knew.
It created a real cognitive dissonance for so many people, and his transition to post-football life only amplified that positive public image. He successfully moved into television and film.
That's where a whole generation who didn't see him play might know him from, particularly his comedic roles in the Naked Gun series. He actually showed a genuine aptitude for comedy.
He did, which added another layer to his likable public persona. But perhaps his most widespread and enduring image came from his work as the spokesperson for Hertz rental cars.
Oh yeah, the Hertz ads. Unforgettable.
Those commercials where he's running through airports, effortlessly leaping over luggage, they perfectly captured an image of agility, capability, and, well, approachability.
The Hertz commercials were incredibly powerful. They just cemented this image of him as wholesome, energetic, trustworthy.
He also worked as a television football commentator for several seasons, staying connected to the sport that made him famous. This seamless transition from legendary athlete to charming media personality undoubtedly contributed to that perception of him as almost invulnerable, untouched by the kinds of troubles regular people faced.
Yeah.
Some sources suggest this cultivated image, combined with the narrative of overcoming his difficult childhood beginnings, might have even fostered a sense of untouchability in his own mind, possibly influencing his actions later on.
It's such a stark contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
The friendly, joking, seemingly perfect public figure versus the darker reality that began to surface in his private life.
And that darker reality was most tragically documented in his relationship with Nicole Brown.
Let's turn our attention to Nicole. Our sources tell us she was born in Frankfurt, West Germany, moved to the U.S. when she was young. She met O.J. in 1977. She was just 18 years old, working as a waitress at a Beverly Hills nightclub called the Daisy. O.J. was 30 at the time.
And this is a key piece of context. When they met, O.J. was still married to his first wife, Marguerite Whitley. Their relationship began while he was still married.
Right. They eventually married on February 2nd, 1985, after his NFL career had ended. They had 2 children together, Sydney, born in 85, and Justin, born in 1988.
Sources note that the birth of their children seemed to coincide with increasing instability and control in O.J.'s behavior, a disturbing hint of the darkness beneath the surface of that famous smile.
And the sources document evidence of O.J.'s emotional, verbal, and unfortunately physical abuse towards Nicole. This pattern wasn't limited to their marriage. It sadly continued even after their divorce.
Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, later gave really powerful emotional testimony about the abuse. She described how Nicole often tried to hide her pain behind a smile, dismissing incidents as isolated or, not a big deal.
That sounds tragically common.
It is. O.J.'s behavior was characterized by Denise as controlling but seemingly generous, again highlighting that deeply troubling public versus private contrast.
And the sources contain specific, deeply disturbing examples shared by Nicole's sisters, like an incident in 1977 where O.J. reportedly went ballistic and became violent simply because Nicole received a kiss on the cheek from a male friend.
There was also an account of him assaulting her during a family vacation in Hawaii after a homosexual man apparently kissed their young son. And the cruel verbal abuse, like him calling her a fat pig while she was pregnant with their child, just awful.
These weren't isolated incidents, as Nicole tried maybe to minimize them. These were patterns of escalating abuse. And Denise Brown took those now infamous photographs in 1989 that showed Nicole's severely battered face evidence that would later be presented in court.
The physical evidence of abuse was undeniable. They divorced in 1992 after 7 years of marriage. They did attempt a reconciliation, but sources indicate their final separation occurred in May 1994, just weeks before the murders.
Just weeks before.
Yeah. This final breakup is presented as a critical piece of context by the prosecution later on.
Because it provides a potential, and for the prosecution, a compelling motive. Jealousy, rage, a reaction to losing control over Nicole after she finally decided to end things for good.
Exactly. Denise Brown later reflected that, like many people back then, she didn't fully understand the dynamics of domestic violence until after Nicole's murder. Nicole's tendency to minimize the abuse, maybe blame herself or hope things would change, is tragically common among victims.
Yeah.
And this likely made it incredibly difficult for her to leave the relationship sooner or permanently.
And this documented history of escalating control and violence, culminating in that final separation just before the murders, it fits a well-established pattern in criminological studies, doesn't it?
It does. Research shows that often the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is precisely when they finally decide to leave the abuser. The abuser perceives a complete loss of control, and this can trigger extreme, sometimes lethal, violence.
Right.
The prosecution would later use this pattern to argue that the murders were not a sudden, random act, but the tragic, violent climax of years of controlling behavior and escalating abuse, triggered by Nicole's final decision to leave. That was the motive presented to the jury.
And all of this history, this tension, this violence, it all tragically converged on one horrific night, June 12th, 1994.
A night that began like any other Sunday evening but ended in just unspeakable tragedy. It's essential, I think, to remember the humanity of the victims beyond their connection to O.J. Simpson.
Absolutely. Nicole Brown Simpson was 35 years old, a mother of 2 young children, a woman reportedly trying to navigate her life after leaving a volatile relationship.
And Ronald Lyle Goldman was just 25. He was working as a waiter. Sources describe him as an aspiring actor and model. He also dedicated his time to volunteering, working with children who had cerebral palsy.
A young guy with his whole life ahead.
Exactly. He had known Nicole for about 6 weeks, and their relationship was described as platonic, friendly.
And Ron Goldman's presence at Nicole's condo that night was just a tragic, almost unbelievable twist of fate. He was simply returning a pair of glasses that Nicole's mother had left at the Mezzaluna restaurant where he worked earlier that evening.
It was an act of kindness, a simple good deed that led him to that specific location at the precise wrong time, placing him directly in the path of a horrific crime. It really underscores the random cruelty that can be part of these violent events.
Let's try and walk through the chronology of that night, based on the details provided in the sources. Nicole had dinner at Mezzaluna with her family after their daughter Sydney's dance recital. O.J. was also present at the restaurant earlier in the evening. Ron Goldman was working his shift. Nicole's mother left her glasses behind.
Right, so around 9:45 p.m., Ron Goldman leaves Mezzaluna with the intention of returning the glasses to Nicole's condo on Bundy Drive. He stopped briefly at his own apartment first.
Okay. Meanwhile, events were apparently unfolding miles away at O.J.'s Rockingham estate. Between 10:41 p.m. and 10:45 p.m., Cato Kalin, who was living in the guest house on the property.
The famous house guest.
Exactly. He testified he heard 3 loud thumps against the wall of his bungalow, near the area where the infamous glove would later be found.
Then, between 10:05 p.m. and 10:55 p.m., a neighbor in Nicole's Brentwood neighborhood saw her white Akita dog running alone, barking agitatedly, and crucially, noticed the dog had bloody paws.
That dog. It would play such a critical, unplanned role in the discovery.
Absolutely. And within minutes of those sounds being heard at Rockingham and the dog being spotted near Bundy, at 11:01 p.m., the limousine driver, Alan Park, who was waiting to take O.J. to the airport for a red-eye flight to Chicago.
He was running late.
Yeah, O.J. is late coming out. Park saw O.J. finally exit his house. Park then drove Simpson to LAX minutes later.
So the timeline places O.J.'s departure from his house right around the time sounds were heard at his estate, and Nicole's dog was seen in her neighborhood with bloody paws.
A sequence the prosecution would later use to place O.J. near the scene, maybe returning from it, just before leaving for the airport. Hours later, just after midnight, at 12:10 a.m. on June 13th, Nicole's distressed Akita dog, still barking, actually led neighbors to the gruesome discovery.
Led them right to the bodies.
Right to the bodies outside her condominium gates on Bundy Drive.
The scene found was just horrific. Sources describe a river of blood. Nicole had suffered multiple stab wounds, her head nearly severed. Ron Goldman had been stabbed almost 30 times. Both bodies showed numerous defensive wounds, indicating a desperate struggle for their lives.
The Akita's actions that night were undeniably critical. Its agitated state and those bloody paws directly led neighbors to discover the bodies. Without the dog's persistence and the neighbors' attention, the crime scene might have remained undiscovered for much longer, potentially complicating the early investigation. It's a chilling example of how chance or, the actions of an animal can be pivotal in crime detection.
And with the discovery of the bodies came the police response. And almost immediately, the investigation itself became a subject of intense controversy.
Police arrived at the Bundy Drive scene around 2:00 a.m. on June 13th. The initial findings on the sidewalk outside the condo were crucial pieces of evidence.
They discovered 5 drops of blood, bloody shoe prints that would later be identified as consistent with size 12 Bruno Magli boots.
A very specific, expensive type of shoe.
A dark knit cap containing hairs, and a bloody leather glove for the left hand.
These items became absolutely central to the prosecution's case, attempting to place the suspect right there at the crime scene. However, sources point out a detail that would later be heavily scrutinized by the defense. Police apparently covered Nicole's body with a blanket taken from inside her condo.
That seems like a pretty basic procedural error for a crime scene investigation, right? Contamination risk.
It was, and you can bet the defense would capitalize on it. Hours later, around 4:30 a.m., police went over to O.J.'s Rockingham estate. The stated purpose was to notify him of Nicole's death.
And while they were there, claiming they had reason to fear for OJ's safety or maybe that others might be inside, they entered the property. Jumped to the wall, some accounts say.
Yes, and once inside, they found more evidence. Blood drops on OJ's driveway and inside his white Ford Bronco parked outside. Then, at 6 a.m., Detective Mark Furman made a critical discovery, a second bloody glove, this one for the right hand, located behind Kato Kalin's guest bungalow. It appeared to be a match for the glove found at Bundy.
Finding a matching bloody glove at OJ's property miles away from the crime scene. That was arguably the most damning piece of physical evidence linking him directly to the murders.
It was intended to be the smoking gun, the missing link for the prosecution. However, sources highlight another crucial detail related to this discovery. There were reportedly no blood drops or shoe prints found near this second glove behind Kato's bungalow.
Odd. How did it get there so cleanly?
Exactly. This detail immediately raised questions about how it got there and became a major point of attack for the defense, particularly given the huge controversies that would later surround Detective Furman himself.
Okay, let's put the Furman controversy aside for just a moment and focus on OJ when he returned. He comes back from Chicago, is eventually handcuffed at his estate, and taken to the police station for questioning.
That's right. He was questioned for several hours that day. During that interview, police observed unexplained cuts on his left hand, which, naturally, raised immediate suspicion. His statements during that time were recorded, though not all of it was later used in court.
Now, the defense didn't just attack the evidence itself. They went after the entire investigation process from the very beginning. They claimed police entered OJ's property illegally, without a valid warrant or genuinely urgent circumstances.
This was a major prong of the defense's strategy from day one. They argued that the police entry was illegal, and therefore any evidence found on the property, including Furman's glove and the blood in the Bronco, should be ruled inadmissible, thrown out.
Fruit of the poisonous tree.
Precisely. While the judge ultimately ruled the entry lawful under the concept of exigent circumstances, basically, an emergency situation, the defense successfully used this action to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the police conduct from the outset. This ruling was crucial, allowing key evidence in, but it also handed the defense a powerful argument about potential police overreach or procedural shortcuts.
Then they pointed to other potential police errors too, didn't they? Like the blanket from Nicole's condo, or that story about a detective, Van Adder, carrying a vial of OJ's blood sample around in his pocket for hours instead of promptly booking it into evidence.
Yes, these specific examples became prime fodder for the defense's overarching theory, which they famously dubbed garbage in, garbage out.
Tetchy.
And effective. The idea was simple. If the initial stages of the investigation, the evidence collection, the handling, were flawed or tainted in any way, then all the evidence derived from that process should be considered unreliable. The defense didn't necessarily need to prove deliberate planting or tampering, at least not initially. They just needed to show enough incompetence or deviation from proper procedure to make the jury question the integrity of the evidence linking OJ to the crime.
So their strategy was basically to undermine the entire foundation of the prosecution's case by attacking the investigators and their methods, step by step.
Precisely. This tactic forced the prosecution into the difficult position of having to defend not only the evidence itself, but also the meticulous details of how every single piece was collected, handled, and preserved. It highlighted the immense scrutiny placed on police work in high-profile cases, and how any perceived misstep could be leveraged by a skilled, well-funded defense team. It fundamentally shifted the trial dynamic towards an examination of the police themselves.
And the level of public scrutiny, already intense, was about to explode into something truly unprecedented, something no one had ever really seen before with the white Bronco chase.
June 17, 1994. O.J. Simpson is formally charged with the murders. He's supposed to surrender to the police at 11:00 a.m. that morning. He doesn't show up.
And just like that, the football hero, the movie star, the Hertz guy, is now officially a fugitive from justice. Then his friend and lawyer, Robert Kardashian, reads this letter from O.J. to the media that sounds disturbingly like a suicide note.
That moment instantly transformed the legal case into this national unfolding drama. His failure to surrender and the tone of that letter were widely interpreted by both law enforcement and much of the public as strong indicators of guilt. Like, why would an innocent man run?
Then, later that day, the chase. The infamous chase began. O.J. is spotted in his white 1993 Ford Bronco. He's being driven by his longtime friend and former teammate, Al Cowlings, or AC.
Sources reported that OJ was in the back seat of the Bronco, reportedly holding a gun to his own head. The chase wasn't high speed. It was this slow, almost surreal pursuit that unfolded over approximately 60 miles along several major LA freeways, the Santa Ana, Artesia, and eventually the San Diego freeway, the 405.
And what made this moment just etched into history was that it was broadcast live on television. An estimated 95 million people dropped everything they were doing to watch that 90-minute low-speed pursuit. It even interrupted Game 5 of the NBA Finals.
It was absolutely surreal. Sources even mentioned seeing crowds of people lining the freeway overpasses, some holding signs, some actually cheering OJ on. It was a bizarre public spectacle. OJ also made a 911 call from inside the Bronco during the chase, which allowed police to track his movements and hear his state of mind.
This event wasn't just a police chase. It felt like a turning point in American media. It completely blurred the lines between news reporting, sports broadcasting, and, well, reality television before reality television was really a thing.
It undeniably demonstrated a massive public appetite for live, unscripted drama involving a famous figure, even under such tragic circumstances. The public reaction from the sheer number of viewers to the crowds on the freeways highlighted his complex and enduring popularity despite the charges and the deeply surreal nature of the whole event.
It really did.
It's widely cited as a moment that foreshadowed the rise of the 24/7 news cycle and laid some groundwork for reality television by proving that live, unfolding events, no matter how bizarre or tragic, could command a massive, captivated audience. Media outlets learned a powerful lesson about ratings that day.
The chase finally ended where it had begun, hours later, back at OJ's Rockingham estate in Brentwood, around 8:00 p.m.
There was about an hour-long standoff before OJ finally surrendered around 9:00 p.m. Sources detail some of his requests during the standoff, including wanting to talk to his mother and famously asking for a glass of orange juice.
And what police found inside the Bronco after he surrendered just further intensified suspicions about his intentions during that whole ordeal.
Oh, yeah. They recovered several very telling items: a fake beard, a fake mustache, a wig, a change of clothes, $8,750 in cash, a loaded .357 Magnum handgun, family photos, and his passport.
I mean, that collection of items strongly suggests preparation for flight, an attempt to disappear or change his appearance.
Yeah. Absolutely. These findings were powerful evidence suggesting he had intended to flee, possibly out of the country, further fueling the perception of his guilt. Following the surrender, he was taken into custody and jailed without bail.
So the incredible drama of the chase was over. The fugitive star was behind bars. And America, glued to its television sets, now braced for the next act, the trial itself, the trial that would become universally known as the trial of the century.
The anticipation was just palpable. Everyone understood this would be a legal proceeding unlike any other. The stakes felt enormous, not just for A.J. Simpson's fate, but for the reputation of the Los Angeles Police Department, and maybe even for the nation's public perception of fairness and justice itself.
Let's look at the key legal players involved in this epic courtroom battle. On the prosecution side, you had the lead prosecutors, Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden.
Marcia Clark was a seasoned, very tough prosecutor. Christopher Darden, an African-American prosecutor, was added to the team, a decision that some saw as an acknowledgement, maybe even a strategic move, considering the case's obvious racial dimensions. Sources note that both faced intense, often incredibly personal media scrutiny throughout the trial, adding another layer of immense pressure to their already challenging roles.
Darden's opening statement to the jury really laid out the prosecution's central narrative for motive, didn't it? That OJ killed her out of jealousy because he couldn't have her. They framed the murders as the final, brutal act of a possessive, controlling relationship.
Establishing a clear, understandable motive was absolutely crucial for the prosecution, providing the jury with a reason why this beloved public figure might commit such a horrific crime. Facing the prosecution was O.J. Simpson's defense team, very quickly dubbed the Dream Team.
And the formation of this team just highlights a significant aspect of the American legal system that the case would later draw so much attention to: the influence of wealth. OJ's substantial financial resources allowed him to assemble an incredibly expensive, star-studded group of legal minds.
It really was an unprecedented collection of legal talent for criminal defense. Robert Shapiro was initially the lead attorney before the charismatic Johnny Cochran eventually took over and became the very public face of the defense.
And the roster of the team was seriously impressive, each bringing specialized expertise to the table.
Absolutely. Beyond Shapiro and Cochran, you had F. Lee Bailey, a legendary defense attorney known for his aggressive cross-examination style, particularly effective later against Furman. Robert Kardashian, a longtime friend of OJ's who reactivated his law license to be part of the team. Alan Dershowitz, a renowned Harvard legal scholar focused on appellate issues.
And critically, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld.
Yes, the DNA guys. They were at the absolute forefront of using and, importantly, challenging DNA evidence in court. Other key members included Robert Blazier, Sean Chapman-Hawley, Gerald Ullman, and Carl Douglas. It was a powerhouse.
This wasn't just a group of lawyers. It was a strategically assembled team designed to attack every single angle of the prosecution's case simultaneously. Their collective expertise, from courtroom performance to forensic science and complex legal strategy, presented a truly formidable challenge to the state.
The sheer depth of expertise allowed them to challenge the prosecution on procedure, evidence handling, scientific interpretation, constitutional arguments, everything. The name Dream Team itself became part of the spectacle, highlighting the power of wealth in assembling such a defense, something most defendants could never dream of.
Presiding over this legal circus, and it really did feel like a circus sometimes, was Judge Lance Ito.
Judge Ito was the Superior Court judge assigned to the case. Sources mention criticisms of his handling of the trial, with some suggesting he was perhaps overly lenient at times, or struggled to maintain firm control amidst the media frenzy and the constant battling between these high-powered legal teams.
But his most impactful decision, the one that fundamentally shapes public perception of the trial, was allowing television cameras in the courtroom.
Oh, absolutely. That was a complete game changer. It turned complex legal proceedings into daily national viewing. Judge Ito himself became nationally famous overnight. The cameras ensured that every piece of evidence, every witness reaction, every lawyer's tactic was broadcast live, potentially influencing the participants' behavior, and certainly influencing how the public experienced and judged the trial in real time. It was a monumental moment for the role of media in the justice system.
And the jury itself was the subject of intense focus, particularly its composition. The jury was selected in November 1994 and ultimately consisted of 8 black jurors, 1 white juror, 1 Hispanic juror, and 2 jurors of mixed race, 8 women and 4 men.
The racial makeup of the jury was considered highly significant from the start, especially given the defense's signaled strategy involving issues of race and policing in Los Angeles.
And the jury was sequestered for an absolutely astonishing period of time.
Yes, they were sequestered starting in January 1995 for an unprecedented 265 days, nearly 9 months. The purpose of sequestration is to isolate the jury from the intense media coverage and public opinion swirling around the case.
But being cut off for that long.
It inevitably created immense stress on the jurors and undoubtedly influenced their group dynamics, separating them from their families, their jobs, their entire daily lives for almost a year. Imagine.
So you have this backdrop, immense anticipation, a high-stakes legal battle, a media frenzy fueled by courtroom cameras, a racially diverse jury facing immense pressure, and a defense team with vast resources and specialized expertise ready to challenge absolutely everything. That sets the stage for the trial of the century.
Absolutely. The prosecution approached the trial seemingly confident, believing they had what they consistently termed a mountain of evidence that would prove OJ's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt.
Their foundation was built on establishing that motive we talked about and presenting a timeline that placed OJ at the Bundy crime scene.
Their central motive argument, as we discussed, was that OJ killed Nicole out of jealousy and possessiveness, triggered by their final breakup in May 1994. They argued this breakup was the final catalyst after years of a tumultuous, controlling relationship.
And they presented the history of domestic violence as crucial context for that motive to show a pattern.
Yes. They introduced extensive evidence detailing OJ's pattern of emotional, verbal, and physical abuse towards Nicole over many years. The emotional testimony of Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, recounting specific incidents of abuse, was a powerful moment intended to show this pattern wasn't just a few isolated fights, but a consistent history.
Right.
The prosecution argued that the murders were the tragic, violent culmination of OJ's long-standing need for control and his history of abuse.
The defense predictably countered this hard, arguing the history of abuse was irrelevant to the specific murder charges and was simply an attempt to unfairly portray OJ as a violent person, classic character assassination.
And it's worth remembering that in 1995, public understanding and discussion of domestic violence, while definitely growing, was perhaps not as widespread or nuanced as it is today. How that evidence landed with the jury is hard to say exactly.
The core of the prosecution's case, the mountain they believed was irrefutable, was the physical and forensic evidence.
This included a really substantial array of evidence linking OJ to the victims and the crime scenes. For example, the victims' blood, Nicole's and Ron's, was found inside OJ's white Ford Bronco. Even more damning, perhaps, blood matching the victims was found on socks discovered in OJ's bedroom at his Rockingham estate.
And OJ's own blood was found at the Bundy crime scene itself, right? Near the gate where the bodies were discovered and on the walkway leading away from the bodies. Drops of it.
Exactly. Plus, hair consistent with OJ's was recovered from Ron Goldman's shirt and from that dark knit cap found near the bodies at Bundy. Fibers consistent with the carpet found in OJ's Bronco were also found on that knit cap and on the bloody glove recovered at Bundy.
And then, of course, the bloody shoe prints found at Bundy matching OJ's shoe size and identified as consistent with a size 12 Bruno Magli boot. This was particularly significant because OJ flatly denied ever owning such expensive, distinctive shoes.
Although, as we'll discuss later, photos later emerged in the civil trial showing him wearing those exact boots at a football game months earlier. And then there were the two matching bloody leather gloves, the left-hand glove found at the Bundy crime scene and the right-hand glove found behind the guest house at OJ's Rockingham estate.
This is where DNA evidence became absolutely central. The prosecution used this relatively new cutting-edge technology to link OJ to his blood found at Bundy and the victim's blood found at Rockingham and in his Bronco.
DNA technology was incredibly powerful scientific evidence directly linking OJ to the crime scenes and the victims. Each piece of evidence was detailed extensively through expert testimony. On paper, this mountain looked incredibly difficult, maybe impossible to overcome.
So with all of that physical evidence, the blood, the hair, the fibers, the shoe prints, the matching gloves, all backed by DNA, it really does seem like the prosecution had an open and shut case. How on earth did the defense manage to create reasonable doubt against all that?
That's the core insight into the brilliance, or perhaps the controversy, depending on your view, of the defense strategy. While the scientific links presented by the prosecution were strong, the very novelty of DNA technology to the average juror in 1995 presented a significant vulnerability.
People didn't really understand it yet.
Not like today. The defense experts, Scheck and Neufeld, were absolute masters at explaining the complex collection and analysis processes in excruciating detail, focusing relentlessly on any potential for contamination, mishandling, or procedural error, however small. They expertly exploited the public's and the jury's unfamiliarity with DNA, creating confusion and skepticism about the reliability of the results, despite the powerful scientific findings pointing towards OJ.
So what should have been the prosecution's strongest asset? This cutting-edge scientific evidence became a huge battleground where the defense successfully sowed seeds of doubt about the process behind the science, not necessarily the science itself.
Exactly. The defense's goal wasn't necessarily to prove the DNA evidence was wrong, but to raise enough doubt about the integrity of how the samples were collected, handled, stored, and analyzed. They focused on every minor procedural error, every perceived deviation from standard protocol, to suggest the evidence was tainted or unreliable. They kept bringing back their powerful garbage in, garbage out theory to discredit the evidence at its source.
Making the links seem shaky.
Precisely. This meant the prosecution had to constantly defend not just the evidence, but its entire chain of custody and handling process, which shifted the jury's focus away from the results and onto the potential for human error or even misconduct.
And that brings us to the defense's multi-layered, incredibly aggressive counterattack. They weren't just playing defense, they were going on the offensive from day one, creating this alternative narrative of doubt and, well, conspiracy.
The primary strategy, their only path, really, was to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. They weren't necessarily trying to prove OJ's innocence, not in the traditional sense. They just needed to make the jury uncertain that the prosecution had proven his guilt beyond that reasonable doubt, which is the very high standard required for a criminal conviction.
A major part of that attack was dismantling the credibility of the police investigation itself, right from the start.
Absolutely. They launched a fierce, sustained criticism of the LAPD investigation, alleging widespread misconduct, shocking incompetence in handling evidence, and even hinting strongly at deliberate tampering or planting of evidence. They focused relentlessly on perceived flaws in crime scene management and claimed the evidence was hopelessly contaminated.
And LAPD criminalist Dennis Fung's admission, under that intense cross-examination by defense attorney Barry Scheck, that he had made procedural errors at the crime scene, that was a huge moment for the defense, wasn't it?
It was massive. It provided concrete validation for the defense's claims of incompetence and mishandling right from one of the key people involved. Their mantra, garbage in, garbage out wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was their recurring theme, used relentlessly to argue that any evidence collected or handled improperly couldn't be trusted, making the links to O.J. seem unreliable or at least questionable to the jury.
But perhaps the most controversial and arguably the most effective element of the defense strategy was bringing the explosive issue of race into the courtroom in such an explicit and central way.
The defense argued quite directly that O.J. Simpson was being framed by racist police officers simply because he was a rich, famous black man. The strategy was meticulously designed to resonate deeply with the predominantly African-American jury, particularly in Los Angeles, a city still deeply scarred by recent raw memories of racial injustice and police brutality.
And Detective Mark Furman, the detective who found that critical second glove at O.J.'s Rockingham estate, became the absolute central target of this strategy, the embodiment of it.
Yes. By portraying Furman as a deeply racist individual, a liar, and someone capable of planting evidence, the defense aimed to cast the deepest possible doubt on that vital piece of physical evidence, the glove that physically connected O.J.'s home to the crime scene. This tactic tapped directly into legitimate, long-standing grievances within the black community regarding the LAPD's history of misconduct and racial bias.
This strategy was just inextricably linked to the recent history in Los Angeles, specifically the 1991 beating of Rodney King by LAPD officers, the officer's shocking acquittal in 1992, and the devastating riots that followed. That context was everything.
That context was absolutely crucial. You cannot understand the trial or the verdict without it. Deep frustration, anger, and widespread distrust of the LAPD, particularly within the African-American community, were still very fresh and palpable in 1995. The defense masterfully exploited this existing lack of trust. Detective Tom Lange, one of the lead homicide detectives on the case, reportedly believed privately that the O.J. case was never going to be won by the prosecution, precisely because of this volatile racial and political context. The defense, and later the bombshell Furman tapes, provided what many jurors might have seen as concrete proof of the very racism and willingness to engage in misconduct that they already suspected or knew existed within the LAPD, lending significant credibility to the defense's framing theory.
The defense also challenged the prosecution's evidence directly, point by point, beyond just claiming contamination or framing.
They worked tirelessly to inject doubt about the reliability of the DNA results themselves, the interpretation of hair and fiber evidence, the timing, everything.
And this culminated in one of the most memorable moments of the trial, perhaps the most visually damaging moment for the prosecution, the infamous glove demonstration.
It was a pivotal, highly theatrical moment orchestrated, really forced by the defense. The prosecution, maybe overconfidently, maybe feeling pressured, asked O.J. to try on the actual bloody gloves found at Bundy and Rockingham right there in court in front of the jury. He visibly struggled, grimacing, seemingly unable to fit his hand fully into the leather gloves.
And Johnny Cochran immediately seized on that powerful visual moment,
leading to his now iconic rhythmic line delivered with such confidence in closing arguments, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit."
That moment was just incredibly powerful and damaging for the prosecution's case. It became the soundbite of the trial.
It was devastating. While there were later explanations offered, the leather gloves may have shrunk from being soaked in blood and then drying, or O.J. may have been wearing latex gloves underneath during the crime, which made them tighter, or maybe he was deliberately manipulating his hands to make them seem too small. The visual of O.J. struggling with the gloves in court was unforgettable for the jury and the millions watching on television.
Yeah, you can't unsee that.
Many legal experts consider the prosecution's decision to ask him to try on the gloves in court a major strategic blunder. It created a potent, easily understandable visual narrative that perfectly encapsulated the defense's reasonable doubt argument. It made the evidence itself seem questionable.
So the defense wasn't just arguing points of law or scientific evidence. They were creating a compelling, often dramatic performance for the jury, and just as importantly, for the millions watching on television every day.
Exactly. They consistently hammered home the concept of reasonable doubt, reminding the jury again and again they didn't need to believe O.J. was innocent, only that the prosecution hadn't proven his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt based on the evidence presented, especially evidence they argued was tainted, mishandled, or potentially planted. Every challenge piece of evidence, every procedural error highlighted, every attack on police credibility contributed to that singular goal: create doubt.
The presence of cameras in the courtroom truly turned this legal proceeding into a form of national theater, didn't it?
It really did. Judge Ito's decision to allow cameras meant the trial wasn't confined to the courthouse walls. It was a daily televised drama playing out in living rooms across America and around the world. Millions tuned in, making key moments instantly iconic and lawyers into household names.
We've talked about the glove demonstration as a prime example of this kind of high-stakes courtroom drama.
Undeniably, that visual moment was masterfully leveraged by the defense. But the revelations surrounding Detective Mark Fuhrman were perhaps the most explosive and legally significant dramatic turn in the entire trial.
Let's recap that sequence again because it was so critical. Mark Fuhrman was a crucial prosecution witness, the detective who found the second glove at Rockingham. In March 1995, while testifying under oath, he explicitly denied using a specific racial slur, the N-word, in the past 10 years.
Then, months later, in August 1995, these audio tapes surfaced. They were recordings of Fuhrman speaking with an aspiring screenwriter named Laura McKinney over several years. On these tapes, Fuhrman was recorded repeatedly using that exact racial slur dozens of times and bragging about instances of police misconduct, including planting evidence or fabricating probable cause in other cases.
The judge ruled that while the jury couldn't hear all of the inflammatory tapes, they were allowed to hear limited, carefully selected excerpts in September 1995, where Fuhrman clearly used the slur he had denied using.
And critically, when Fuhrman was called back to the stand and questioned further about the tapes and his prior testimony, this happened outside the presence of the jury, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, refusing to answer questions about whether he had lied under oath, committed perjury, about his use of the slur.
This was just devastating for the prosecution's case and a massive game-changing win for the defense.
It completely destroyed Mark Fuhrman's credibility as a witness in the eyes of the jury, and arguably the nation watching. It provided concrete, undeniable evidence of the very racism the defense had been alleging was present within the LAPD and potentially involved in framing OJ. This wasn't just an accusation anymore, it was on tape in his own voice.
Right. Proof.
It lent powerful credibility to the defense's theory that a racist officer like Fuhrman was capable of planting crucial evidence like the glove found at Rockingham. Johnny Cochran's controversial comparison of Fuhrman to Adolf Hitler during his closing arguments, while widely criticized as extreme, underscores just how central Fuhrman's documented racism became to the defense narrative of a race-motivated frame-up. Fuhrman became the face of LAPD corruption for the defense.
Beyond Fuhrman and the gloves, other witness testimonies added layers to the trial's public fascination and drama.
The raw, emotional account of domestic violence from Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, was certainly impactful for many. The testimony of Cato Kalin, the house guest who heard the thumps, was often rambling, confused, or seemingly inconsistent under intense cross-examination, adding a strange, almost comedic element for some viewers, and just confusion for others. He became a sort of bizarre celebrity himself.
Yeah, he did.
Even OJ's daughter, Arnell Simpson, testified movingly for the defense about her father's state of mind. Many of the key witnesses in this trial on both sides became minor celebrities simply by being part of the daily televised drama.
And with cameras capturing every single moment, every reaction, the lawyers themselves, particularly on the defense side led by the incredibly charismatic Johnny Cochran, seemed keenly aware of the enormous television audience watching their every move.
Undeniably. The presence of cameras and the intense public fascination turned the courtroom into a de facto theater. Lawyers make strategic decisions, chose specific lines of questioning, and delivered arguments that seemed designed not just for the 12 jurors in the box, but for the millions watching at home. The glove demonstration, Cochran's rhythmic rhetoric, the relentless focus on Fuhrman's tapes. These weren't just dry legal tactics. They were dramatic events carefully staged or leveraged for maximum impact in the court of public opinion, as well as the actual court. It highlights how, in a case this high-profile and televised, legal strategy necessarily encompassed elements of public relations and performance art.
After 9 long months of this unprecedented televised spectacle, the mountains of evidence, the controversies, the drama, the case finally went to the jury for deliberation.
The jury began their deliberations on September 29, 1995.
And the speed of their decision just shocked almost everyone, didn't it? Especially after such a long trial.
It was absolutely astonishing. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before reaching a unanimous verdict on both murder counts. This speed was particularly surprising given the immense length and complexity of the trial, the vast amount of scientific evidence presented, and the multitude of witnesses they'd heard from over 9 months.
Yeah, 4 hours seems incredibly fast.
For many observers, the swiftness suggested that the jury had largely made up its mind much earlier in the trial, perhaps during the defense's presentation or after the Furman revelations, or simply that the defense's strategy of relentlessly creating reasonable doubt had been profoundly effective in undermining the prosecution's mountain of evidence.
The verdict was actually reached on October 2nd, 1995, but it wasn't formally announced and read in court until the following day, October 3rd, 1995, allowing for family members to be present.
And the outcome, which reverberated instantly around the world, was O.J. Simpson was found not guilty on 2 counts of murder.
The reaction across the United States was immediate, intense, and revealed a nation starkly, painfully divided.
The reaction was profoundly divided, and primarily along racial lines. Polls conducted immediately after the verdict showed this remarkable chasm in perception. A significant majority of African Americans polled believed O.J. was innocent, or at least not proven guilty, and felt that justice had been served, perhaps seeing it as a rare instance where the system didn't automatically convict a black man, especially given the police misconduct shown.
While on the other side,
Conversely, a large majority of white Americans polled believed he was guilty and viewed the verdict as a shocking miscarriage of justice, with some seeing it as a form of racially motivated jury nullification, jurors ignoring the evidence to send a message.
this was one of the most palpable public demonstrations of the persistent racial divide in modern American history. The same trial, the same evidence, fundamentally interpreted so differently through the lens of race, experience, and trust in the justice system.
And this division, as we've touched on, cannot be understood outside the crucial historical context of race relations in Los Angeles, particularly the events surrounding Rodney King just a couple of years prior. The trial took place just 2 years after the devastating 1992 LA riots, which erupted following the acquittal of the LAPD officers involved in King's brutal beating.
Deep-seated frustration, anger, and widespread distrust of the LAPD, especially within the African American community, were very real and very fresh wounds in 1995.
Absolutely. Detective Tom Lange's reported private belief that the prosecution faced an uphill battle precisely because of this context is telling. Sources indicate that some jurors later stated that even if they personally believed O.J. might have committed the crime, they could not, in good conscience, convict him based on evidence presented by a police department they perceived as corrupt or capable of planting evidence, especially after the undeniable proof of Furman's racism and dishonesty came out.
So for some, particularly within the African American community, the acquittal was seen less about O.J.'s individual guilt or innocence and more as a symbolic rejection of a justice system perceived as historically biased, unfair, and discriminatory toward black individuals. A system that finally got caught, in a way.
The Furman tapes provided concrete, undeniable proof of the type of racism that many black Americans believed was systemic within the LAPD, lending significant credibility to the defense's theory that O.J. could have been framed. Some interpreted the incredible speed of the verdict as a powerful statement that in the face of such deeply eroded trust in the system, its evidence, particularly when intertwined with blatant issues of racial injustice, simply could not be relied upon to meet the high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt.
Though some jurors did clarify later.
Yes, it's important to note some jurors later clarified that while they might have had personal beliefs about his guilt, they felt the prosecution had failed to meet its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, emphasizing the specific legal standard they were bound by and the tangible impact of the defense's relentless attacks on the investigation's integrity and Furman's credibility. They focused on the doubt.
While the criminal trial ended with that stunning acquittal, this wasn't the final word in the legal saga for O.J. Simpson regarding the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. The victims' families were determined to pursue justice in a different venue.
That's correct. Understandably unsatisfied and frankly devastated by the outcome of the criminal trial, the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman pursued a civil lawsuit against O.J. Simpson, seeking to hold him financially liable or responsible for their deaths.
Nicole's family and Ron Goldman's family, including his incredibly determined and outspoken father, Fred Goldman, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against O.J., seeking both compensatory and punitive damages. The civil trial began in October 1996.
This moved the legal battle to a completely new arena, Santa Monica Civil Court, operating under very different rules and standards than the criminal court downtown.
And these differences proved to be incredibly significant and likely had a major impact on the eventual outcome.
Crucially, the jury composition in the civil trial was very different. It was predominantly white, reflecting the demographics of Santa Monica more than downtown LA. Unlike the media spectacle of the criminal trial, cameras were strictly prohibited in the civil courtroom, leading to far less media saturation and much less public performance from the lawyers.
And the burden of proof was much lower.
Yes, that's perhaps the most significant legal difference. In civil court, the standard was preponderance of the evidence, which simply means the jury only had to find it more likely than not, basically. 50.1% certain that O.J. was responsible for the deaths, rather than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, which is much higher.
And another critical difference was that O.J. could be, and was, compelled to testify in the civil trial, unlike in the criminal trial, where he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and chose not to take the stand.
Yes, O.J.'s lengthy, often contentious testimony became part of the evidence considered by the civil jury. Furthermore, new evidence was presented in the civil trial that had not been shown effectively or at all in the criminal trial. Most notably, those photographs showing O.J. Simpson wearing Bruno Magli's shoes of the exact type, size, and style that left bloody prints at the crime scene.
Those photos directly contradicted O.J.'s sworn denials in his deposition and earlier statements that he never owned such ugly-ass shoes as he apparently called them. They were reportedly quite damning for the civil jury.
They were powerful visual evidence presented under that much lower standard of proof. So you have a different jury pool, far less media influence in courtroom theater, a lower burden of proof, O.J.'s own compelled testimony on the stand for days, and damaging new evidence like the Bruno Magli photos, all factors that created a fundamentally different trial dynamic. The verdict in the civil trial came down on February 4th, 1997.
And the outcome this time was completely different. The civil jury found O.J. Simpson liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman.
The jury awarded the families substantial damages. $8.5 million in compensatory damages split between the families, and a whopping $25 million in punitive damages, totaling $33.5 million.
Despite this huge judgment, O.J. famously used various legal maneuvers to avoid paying most of the awarded amount, didn't he? Shielding his considerable NFL pension funds from seizure and utilizing Florida's generous homestead exemption for real estate after moving there.
Yes. While some of his assets, like his Heisman Trophy and other memorabilia, were eventually confiscated and sold at auction to help satisfy the judgment, the families reportedly received only a relatively small fraction of the total awarded amount over the years.
Still, the civil verdict.
The civil verdict, while not a criminal conviction carrying prison time, provided a significant measure of legal validation and a form of justice, or at least accountability, for the victims' families, particularly the Goldmans who had been so vocal. O.J.'s subsequent actions to avoid paying the judgment further damaged his public image for many people who saw it as cynical evasion.
The civil verdict, influenced by those different rules, a different jury, O.J.'s testimony, and crucial new evidence like the Bruno Magli photos, offered a resolution that many people felt was closer to the truth, even if it didn't, and legally couldn't, overturn the criminal acquittal. It did, to some extent, shift the dominant public narrative for those who had been deeply troubled by the criminal verdict.
It definitely highlighted that the outcome of a legal case can depend significantly on the specific jurisdiction, the type of trial, criminal versus civil, the rules of evidence allowed, the composition of the jury, and the standard of proof required factors that are distinct from the underlying truth of what happened, which courts aren't always perfectly equipped to find.
Even after the criminal acquittal and the civil finding of liability, the events of 1994 continued to cast this long, inescapable shadow over O.J. Simpson's life. He never truly escaped the public eye or the legacy of the case.
His post-trial life became the strange mix of attempts at living normally, often playing golf, but punctuated by recurring legal issues and being a perpetual subject of public fascination and intense scrutiny, though now his fame was irreversibly tainted with infamy for most people.
There were several instances where he ended up back in the news, usually for less significant offenses.
Yeah, like being acquitted in a road rage incident in Miami-Dade, Florida, back in 2001, or a lawsuit brought against him by the satellite TV company DirecTV in 2005 for allegedly pirating their services, resulting in a $25,000 judgment against him. He largely lived out of the direct glare of the kind of national spotlight he endured during the murder trial, but he remained this very controversial, unavoidable public figure.
But the most significant and ultimately life-altering post-trial legal trouble came from that bizarre incident in Las Vegas.
On September 13, 2007, O.J. and several other men confronted two sports memorabilia dealers, Alfred Beardsley and Bruce Fromong, in a room at the Palace Station Hotel in Las Vegas. O.J. claimed the dealers had stolen items that belonged to him, precious memorabilia from his own career that he wanted back.
Sources describe the incident as a sort of commando-style raid, and it was reported that at least one of O.J.'s associates brandished a firearm during the confrontation, although O.J. maintained he didn't know anyone was armed.
They ended up taking items from the room, including pillowcases reportedly filled with O.J.'s memorabilia. This seemingly bizarre, almost desperate, and certainly ill-advised attempt to recover his own property felt like a strange, sad, and ultimately self-destructive epilogue to his earlier life and career.
And this incident very quickly led to his arrest, just 3 days later, on September 16, 2007. He was charged with numerous serious felonies, including kidnapping and armed robbery. His trial for these charges began in September 2008.
And here's where the timing becomes just strikingly, almost unbelievably ironic. He was convicted by the Las Vegas jury on October 3rd, 2008.
Exactly 13 years to the day after he was acquitted in the double murder trial back in Los Angeles. The symbolism was just impossible to ignore.
A coincidence that many people, regardless of their beliefs about the 1995 verdict, interpreted as a form of delayed justice or even karmic retribution, even though the Las Vegas charges were completely unrelated to the 1994 murders. He was found guilty on 12 counts, including the most serious charges of armed robbery and kidnapping.
His sentencing followed in December 2008.
He received a hefty sentence of 33 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving a minimum of 9 years. The Clark County District Attorney, David Roger, commented after the verdict that the evidence against O.J. was strong and seemed to suggest O.J. felt he was invulnerable, that he could get away with anything.
His sentence was seen by some as quite harsh, maybe disproportionately so, especially compared to the sentences received by some of his co-defendants in the Las Vegas robbery case, who mostly got probation or shorter terms after cooperating.
This definitely sparked debate about whether his past notoriety and the lingering public perception from the murder trial had influenced the severity of his sentence. Was this finally deserved punishment for someone who many felt had beaten the system back in '95? Or was it an overcorrection by the justice system, perhaps unfairly influenced by his fame and controversial past? It's a point people still argue about.
O.J. served his sentence primarily at Lovelock Correctional Center, a remote medium-security prison in Nevada. He was eventually granted parole and released on October 1st, 2017, after serving the minimum 9 years required by his sentence.
His final years were relatively quiet, lived mostly in Las Vegas and Florida, often seen golfing. His death from cancer on April 10, 2024, at the age of 76, inevitably reignited widespread discussion and intense re-examination of his extraordinary, turbulent, and deeply controversial life, and of course, the infamous trial that defined it for so many people around the globe.
The timing of the Las Vegas conviction, on the 13th anniversary of his murder acquittal, remains this powerful symbolic element of his story, a coincidence interpreted by many as deeply meaningful, whether as justice finally served, however indirectly, or simply a stark commentary on the long, inescapable reach of his past actions and notoriety.
It really underscores how O.J. Simpson's life, particularly after 1994, could never truly be separated from the events of that year and their complex, endlessly debated outcomes. Even completely unrelated legal troubles were inevitably viewed through the long lens of the murder trial.
The O.J. Simpson case was far more than just a criminal trial. It was a genuine cultural earthquake that profoundly impacted American society and its institutions in ways we're still feeling today.
The media impact alone was absolutely revolutionary. The nonstop live coverage, CNN and court TV broadcasting all 134 days of testimony, didn't just reflect the rise of the 24/7 news cycle. It arguably fueled it and was a direct precursor to the explosion of modern reality television. It showed the immense public appetite for that kind of unscripted drama.
Sources suggest the immense ratings and public engagement with the trial even influenced the landscape of cable news, potentially playing a role in the founding of networks like Fox News later that decade, demonstrating the proven market for this type of opinionated, personality-driven coverage of major events.
It also sparked intense, ongoing debate about the wisdom of allowing cameras in the courtroom. Today, 47 states allow cameras in some form, but critics still argue it transforms justice into spectacle, can intimidate witnesses or encourage jurors to make decisions based on public perception, and definitely encourages lawyers to play to the cameras rather than just focusing on the jury.
There's also that critique.
Yeah, the critique that the relentless pursuit of sensationalism by both tabloids and mainstream media during the trial led to a kind of bad journalism driving out good, where nuance and careful reporting were sacrificed for ratings and scoops. The trial was unquestionably a watershed moment for how legal proceedings are covered and consumed by the public, with lasting consequences.
The case also left a deep, undeniable mark on the legal system itself.
It brought complex legal procedures and the intricacies of forensic science, particularly the use and limitations of DNA evidence, into the national conversation like never before. It also starkly exposed the undeniable influence of wealth on the quality of legal representation one can afford, sparking ongoing, vital debates about equal access to justice in America, the uncomfortable truth that money matters, and matters hugely in the courtroom.
And the aggressive, meticulous challenges brought by the incredibly well-funded defense team actually led to some positive changes in the long run, didn't it, in terms of procedure?
Yes, ironically, that's true. Their intense scrutiny and successful challenges to evidence handling standards really did raise the bar for crime labs and detectives across the country. It prompted significantly increased focus on meticulous evidence collection protocols, strict chain of custody procedures, and rigorous handling, particularly regarding the crucial risks of DNA contamination.
So standards improved because of the defense's attacks.
In many ways, yes. While DNA technology was still relatively new and unfamiliar to many jurors and the public in 1995, the trial highlighted both its incredible potential power and the absolute necessity of rigorous, unimpeachable standards for its collection, analysis, and presentation in court. The defense exposed weaknesses that needed fixing.
And of course, the impact on race relations in America is perhaps one of the most significant and certainly one of the most complex and painful legacies of the trial.
The dramatically divergent reactions to the film intakes, and especially to the final verdict, split so clearly and immediately along racial lines, exposed deep, painful divisions and profound distrust that existed and sadly continue to exist within American society regarding race, policing, and the perceived fairness of the justice system.
Yeah.
For many, particularly African Americans, the acquittal was seen, at least in part, as a form of symbolic justice, maybe even a payback for historical and ongoing racial injustice suffered at the hands of law enforcement. Sources even point to a potential link, or at least a correlation in timing, between the trial's outcome and a measured decrease in empathy for racial discrimination issues among some white Americans, and its proximity to the passage of California's controversial Proposition 209 in 1996, which effectively ended affirmative action in state government functions.
So it had real political ripple effects.
It arguably did. The trial forced an uncomfortable, often deeply painful national conversation about race, policing, and justice that continues to resonate very strongly today. It revealed fault lines that haven't healed.
However, amidst these difficult and often divisive legacies, one arguably positive, or at least significant outcome, was the major impact the case had on raising public awareness about domestic violence.
This is often cited as a crucial, albeit tragically born, legacy of the case. Nicole Brown Simpson's murder and the extensive focus during the trial on O.J.'s documented history of spousal abuse dramatically brought the often hidden issue of domestic violence into the national spotlight in a way it never had been before. It helped shift the public perception from seeing it primarily as a private family matter to recognizing it as a serious, pervasive, violent crime.
And the Violence Against Women Act, a landmark piece of federal legislation passed by Congress in 1994, actually cited Nicole's case during debates as a catalyst for its passage. It's sometimes referred to informally as the O.J. rule because it highlighted the deadly potential of abuse.
And Nicole's sister, Denise Brown, became a prominent and tireless activist in the years following, raising awareness and advocating for victims' rights and resources. This terrible tragedy, amplified through the relentless lens of the trial, forced a hidden epidemic into the national conversation, leading to important legislative changes, increased funding for support services, and significantly greater public recognition of the signs, patterns, and severity of domestic abuse.
So the legacy of the O.J. Simpson saga is undeniably paradoxical, isn't it? On one hand, it's seen as exacerbating racial divisions, contributing to the sensationalization of media coverage, and starkly highlighting the inequities of the legal system when influenced by extreme wealth.
While, on the other hand, it simultaneously and significantly catalyzed increased awareness and societal response to domestic violence, prompted critical reevaluation and improvement of police procedures and forensic standards, and forced a long overdue, if deeply uncomfortable, national reckoning with race and justice in America. It divided the nation profoundly, but also pushed forward some important discussions and reforms, reflecting the complex, contradictory elements at the very heart of the case itself.
The O.J. Simpson case was truly more than just a crime or a trial. It was a genuine cultural phenomenon. It was a story about fame, race, wealth, violence, media, and law, all colliding. And ultimately, it acted like a giant mirror held up to the American soul, reflecting back complex, often painful truths about our society and the intricate, sometimes deeply flawed nature of our legal system.
It laid bare divisions that unfortunately persist today and fundamentally changed how we consume news, how we think about celebrity, and how we understand the complex dynamics of justice, accountability, and inequality in America. Its echoes are still felt.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, based on everything we've discussed from the sources. Given the stark differences in outcome between the criminal trial, which required that very high standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the civil trial, which required only a preponderance of the evidence and considering those outcomes, were influenced by factors like jury composition, different rules about admissible evidence like the Bruno Magli photos, and the crucial ability to compel O.J. Simpson's testimony in the civil case. What does the O.J. Simpson saga ultimately tell us about the very nature of justice in the American legal system? And perhaps more pointedly, for who is that justice most accessible and achievable?